A similar problem arises when we try to think of the grotesque. Anthropomorphism, according to John Berger, is integral to the relation between man and animal, and is an expression of their proximity. Anthropomorphism arises precisely from what Roscioli calls the uncanny proximity between humans and animals. It is therefore no coincidence that James Paxson, in his Treatise on Personification, when discussing anthropomorphism, as a non-trope associated with personification, states that, quoting, anthropomorphism might at first seem mechanical, but it is a complex, coordinate trope of personification that looks at the same time simpler. Anthropomorphism seems to be little more than animated words and more uncanny, its seeming power to freeze or escape tropology. He even goes so far as to describe it as a provocative trope. So this ambiguity surrounding anthropomorphism, which is evident in the quoted definition, occurs on two levels. First, in the definition of what is and what is not human, what is the human form, which is then transferred to something non-human according to the dialectic of inclusion and exclusion, and then also the question of whether or not anthropomorphism is a trope at all, and whether or not, if as a trope, does not destabilize the whole tropological system and thus constitutes a much more fundamental operation that precedes all other tropological operations. That, if I go even further, makes all other tropological operations possible. As such, it speaks primarily of our understanding of the relationship between the human and the non-human from which it emerges. So anthropomorphism is one of the best examples of the impossibility of distinguishing between non-human and human, of the vagueness and arbitrariness of the boundary between human and non-human, which in turn has, of course, implications for the vagueness of anthropomorphism as such, and for the question constantly arises of whether anthropomorphism is part of the problem or part of the solution. If I now also turn to the uncanny used in Paxson's definition, we cannot overlook the reference to the Freudian unheimlich as that kind of uncanny, which Freud, following Schlegel, understands as that which slips from what has always been known, the long familiar, and which is at the same time that which is supposed to remain secret, concealed, and has come to light. Anthropomorphism, then, in a way, helps us to see the unstable nature of the human. And this is what makes it uncanny and where it shows its links with the grotesque, in the center of which stands a body in the act of becoming. As such, anthropomorphism represents an ontological interruption, an intervention, and we should also say a certain realism. James Paxson, in formulating his before-mentioned definition of anthropomorphism, partly follows Demand's claims about anthropomorphism in his essay Anthropomorphism and Trope in the Lyric from the 80s. Paul Demand's essay, in most of which he analyzes the connection of people and their opponents, begins with anthropomorphism, which he firstly distinguishes from personification or prosopopia, the main trope of poetic discourse, as he calls it in his essay Resistance to Theory, with which anthropomorphism is constantly and most often closely linked to in the theory. He understands anthropomorphism as a much more fundamental topological operation than personification, as the title of the essay, Anthropomorphism and Trope in the Lyric, already suggests, and implies that anthropomorphism is therefore not a trope, but a cognitive operation that necessarily precedes all figurative translations. He begins his discussion by quoting Nietzsche, who characterizes truth as an army of tropes, quoting, "Was ist also Wahrheit? Ein bewegliches Herr von Metaphern und Anthropomorphism." Jacobson and Jeanette too have considered metaphor and metonymy to be the main topological operations. But what to do with anthropomorphism, which stands out in this sequence, because it is neither a synthesis, neither a complement of that. And although it is structured as a trope, it is not. Or, as the man claims, quoting, But anthropomorphism is not just a trope, but an identification on the level of substance. It takes one entity for another, and thus implies the constitution of specific entities prior to their confusion, taking of something for something else that can then be assumed to be given. Anthropomorphism freezes the infinite chain of topological transformation and propositions into one single assertion or essence, which as such excludes all others. It is no longer a proposition, but a proper name, as when the metamorphosis in Ovid's stories culminates and halts in the singleness of a proper name, decisive, Daphne, or whatever. As Barbara Johnson points out, in the man's understanding of anthropomorphism, it is not the name of a pure rhetorical structure, but the name of a structure in which one of the terms is treated as given, as epistemologically restored. So to use anthropomorphism is to treat the properties of man as known. And the rhetorical aspect of anthropomorphism depends entirely on the self-evident nature of what falls within the domain of the human. So if human is taken for granted, it can only be because it is outside the loop of qualification. It's presupposed, not defined. But the examples the man gives of appropriate names, proper names, are striking. Narcissus and Daphne. So the result of anthropomorphism, the freezing of the infinite chain of topological transformations of the single essence, is, according to the man, comparable to the culmination of metamorphosis. So what he does is make three key points for further reflection of anthropomorphism, which is he distinguishes it from personification. He identifies the mechanism of operation, making it a much more fundamental operation, and finally he links it with metamorphosis. And crucially, even when Daphne becomes a Laurel, Apollo still embraces her as Daphne, in whom her heart beats, as Ovid writes. So the Laurel is never just a lure after the act of metamorphosis. Thus, if the man's post-structuralist thought has made it possible to look at anthropomorphism differently, posthumanist thought, which roughly speaking problematizes anthropocentrism in itself and recognizes human as always already intertwined with the non-human, with matter and technology, leads to a further intensification of a more positive attitude towards anthropomorphism. Serenela Iovine, literary theorist and environmental philosopher, for example, advocates the use of so-called strategic anthropomorphism. Karen Barrett goes a little further, pointing out that she's not so much interested in the strategic anthropomorphism per se, rather she is, quoting, deeply interested in anthropomorphizing as an intervention for shaking loose the crusty toxic scales of anthropocentrism, where the human, in its exceptional way of being, gets to hold all the goodies like agency, intentionality, rationality, etc. That is, I'm interested in troubling the assumptions that prop up the Anthropocene in the first place, including the assumed separation between the human and its others. End of quote. Similar to that, or even further, Bruno Latour, on the other hand, in his non-modern manner, in We Have Never Been Modern from the 90s, problematizing the prohibition of anthropomorphism because it is supposed to function as a regulatory mechanism that serves to strictly separate human and non-human ontologies. However, Latour does not see anthropomorphism as the solution, but points out that, quoting, the expression anthropomorphic considerably underestimates our humanity. We should be talking about morphisms. Morphism is the place where technomorphisms, zoomorphisms, ideomorphisms, etc., all come together. Their alliances and their exchanges taken together are what define the anthropos, a weaver of morphisms. Isn't that enough of a definition? End of quote. And if I go even further than that, in contemporary thought, according to Membe, humanity is in the process of leaving behind the grand divisions between the human, the animal, and the machine, so typical of the discourse of our modernity and of humanism. So today's human is now firmly wedded to its end and its machine. So what we witness, roughly, on one hand, is that anthropomorphism suddenly becomes an essential tool for dismantling Western anthropocentrism. And on the other, in this process, anthropomorphism itself undergoes a certain metamorphosis, in which the human always returns as something fundamentally not human, only potentially human, a temporary result of metamorphosis in which it is human and yet, at the same time, it is something else. With that in mind, I'll turn to the second part, to grotesque. Grotesque, said Victor Hugo, is everywhere. So grotesque, like anthropomorphism, is a concept whose appearance in different contexts does little to clarify the concept itself. Moreover, the later its possible supposed omnipresence appears in the theorization of grotesque itself as one of the central puzzles for theoretical positioning and definition. So grotesque itself is first and foremost a hybrid creature, and there is no such thing as a pure grotesque. That would be a contradiction in terms. The grotesque cannot be contained in a single definition, since it is impossible for something that is primarily transgressive in nature and always in motion to be captured in a single definition. But at the same time, we cannot assert that grotesque can be anything or even everything. Thus, like anthropomorphism, the grotesque presents a problem, a disturbance, which relates to its innermost nature, and it is also reflected in the theorization of the grotesque itself, in the attempts to define and understand it, where it triggers precisely those affects from which it is supposed to emerge, which are supposed to be triggered by its artistic manifestations. So in this sense, grotesque in its essence and its supposed origin is truly playful and transgressive, playful in its transgressiveness. It is not surprising, therefore, that it occupies a marginal place in the system of aesthetics, that it is most often conceived as the opposite of the sublime. But since it is grotesque, of course, here the matter is somewhat more complicated, because in certain attempts to find for it a place that certain theorists believe it deserves in the system of aesthetics, it is on one hand supposed to present precisely the perfection of the sublime expression. One example of that was Victor Hugo. This is how he understood it. So, in this sense, it relates to another specific aspect of the uncanny, one that tends towards the irresolvable of the opposites, or of what is otherwise conceived of as opposites. What is supposed to be the opposite is therefore necessarily contained and unresolved in the grotesque. Horror, laughter, human and non-human. Since there is no inclusive or permanent state of something which does not already contain within it something else. Or, as literary theorist Philip Thompson emphasizes, the grotesque in some forms, at least, an inappropriate expression of the problematical nature of our existence. And if I use an example of Kafka's Gregor Samsa, key protagonist of probably one of the most famous metamorphoses after Ovid's, this is what makes his metamorphosis grotesque, that Gregor Samsa is a beetle, but at the same time, he's still Gregor Samsa. Bakhtin's Rabelais and his world is certainly one of the most important reflections in the fields of attempt to theorize the grotesque. Bakhtin, who thinks about the grotesque, specifically the meaning of the Renaissance grotesque in the context of the culture of folk humor, makes some key points for thinking about the grotesque. So first of all, he considers grotesque as strongly tied to historical context. But regardless of this fact, grotesque imagery is an extremely ancient type, refined in mythology and fine art of all peoples. So at the heart of the grotesque, then, is its indestructible transhistorical essence, captured by the grotesque image. And in the center of this grotesque image is a grotesque body, as is evident from the very origins of the grotesque. So in its search for grotesque's core, the theory therefore most often resorts to the etymology or supposed origin of the grotesque itself, to the paintings of Roman cave discovered in the 15th century, which depict hybrids between humans, animals, and plants. Or with Bakhtin, quoting, "These forms seem to be interwoven as if giving birth to each other. The portalized and divine the kingdoms of nature and the usual picture of the world were both infringed. There was there the usual static representation of reality. There was no longer the movement of finished forms, vegetable or animal, in a finished and stable world. Instead, the inner movement of being itself was expressed in the passing of one form into another, in the ever incompleted character of being." End of quote. Another important emphasis Bakhtin makes is the connection between the grotesque and the realism, coining the term grotesque realism, arguing that this is an overlooked reality that helps us to better understand the entire field of realistic literature of the last 3 centuries. So the central place in grotesque realism occupies a grotesque image, as already mentioned, with its grotesque body. And the grotesque image reflects a phenomenon in transformation, an as yet unfinished metamorphosis of death and birth, growth and becoming. The relation to time is one determining trait of the grotesque image. The other indispensable trait is ambivalence. For in this image, we found both poles of transformation, the old and the new, the dying and the procreating, the beginning and the end of a metamorphosis. And at the center of this grotesque image is the epitome of incompleteness, the grotesque body, which is the unfinished and open body. Dying, bringing forth, and being born is not separated from the world by clearly defined boundaries. It is blended with the world, with animals, with objects. Therefore, grotesque body is not a closed, completed unit. It is unfinished, ungrows itself, transgresses its own limits. With all this in mind, we can now turn to the question of how and why to think about the contemporary grotesque. So awareness of the structural composition of the self has never been more pronounced than it is today, whether we refer to the role of technology or the so-called microbial self. And all of this present a context in which grotesque bodies, in all their power, function as a nexus of cultural anxieties about the human body. Our contemporary condition, therefore, unsurprisingly, represents an era of flourishing or even celebrated grotesque. But at the same time, the question arises as to whether this flourishing, this omnipresence of the grotesque does not mean that it is no longer possible to speak of the grotesque, or that we are already living in a post-grotesque era. Or, if we go even further, perhaps our bodies, not even our bodies, but bodies made of microplastics, bacteria, etc., raise the question of whether we have not always been grotesque. Before I end on this note, I would like to turn at least briefly to another aspect of the contemporary grotesque that should not be overlooked. I will start with what Foucault calls grotesque sovereignty, or even Grotesque, in reference to Jarre's Ubuqua. For Foucault, grotesque sovereignty is one of the essential processes of arbitrary sovereignty and the process of inherent to bureaucracy. So grotesque sovereignty, according to him, is a maximization of the effects of power on the basis of the disqualification of the one who produces them. So this is one of the cogs that are inherent part of the mechanisms of power. Grotesque sovereignty is something that has characterized Western politics from the very beginning. It traces its origins back to the Roman Empire and draws a line from Nero, perhaps the founding figure of the tragic functioning of the despicable sovereign, to the, quoting, little man with trembling hands, crowned with 40 billion debts, who from deep in his bunker asks only 2 things: that everything else above him be destroyed, and that he be given chocolate cakes until he bursts. End of quote. So what this means today is to some extent well portrayed, especially, for example, in the first cruising part of the Östlund's movie Triangle of Sadness from the last year. Also in some contemporary figures, political businessman figures, and in the context of factory farming, to some extent in the movie Okja. in the figure of a factory plant owner played by Tilda Swinton. Thank you.